1, 2. Okay, it looks like we are live on YouTube, and now the recording started. Hi, this is Greg Salmieri, and you're watching the fourth episode of our election discussion group at the Salem Center for Policy in the McCombs School of Business at the University of Texas at Austin. We're discussing the upcoming presidential election and issues connected to it, and trying to get clear on the beliefs and values that are driving our votes. We have with us all people who've been on some past episodes, so no need for introduction. I've said I'm Greg. I am a philosophy fellow, or a fellow in philosophy, or I guess a senior philosophy scholar in the center. We have Carlos on, who's the director of the center. Samuel and Tiger are both students. And I want to start by noting a couple of the events of this week that might people might have thoughts in regard to that they want to share, and then we'll move to some particular shows. Chris is joining us as well. Great. So two main events I think this week that people generated discussion. The Barrett hearings are taking place. It is the hearings on the new potential Supreme Court justice, and there was meant to be a presidential debate yesterday, I guess it was, but it did not happen because of, in the wake of Trump's COVID diagnosis, they changed the rules or changed it to be a virtual debate. Trump didn't want to do that, and so Biden scheduled a town hall when the debate would have happened, and then Trump scheduled another town hall at the same time on a different channel. So you had to take your pick which one to watch, or watch both of them after the fact, as I did, or just not watch. So does anyone, first of all, have any thoughts coming out of the Supreme Court nomination hearings, if anyone's been watching them, that pertain to your vote? We have discussed court issues on here before. So it looked like you were nodding, like you wanted to say something on this.
Yeah, sure. So I actually got to watch some of the Supreme Court hearings a little bit on TV as they were going on, just kind of in between classes. I guess first thing, there's a lot of technical difficulties. So I think Senator Blumenthal was up there, and I think in the span of 20 minutes they had to take like 2 breaks for difficulties. But as far as the substance of the hearings goes, I thought they were more or less what would be expected. I think Republicans sung her praises while the Democrats criticized her. I think the Supreme Court nomination process has gotten extremely partisan. But that's just kind of the time we live in. I think one thing that did stand out to me was that Amy Coney Barrett, I think one of the big, I think they're trying to play, both parties trying to play this within the context of the election. So, Republicans will immediately say, Democrats talked about her faith in a bad way. And I think Democrats are trying to play the healthcare angle of this. I think as far as Obamacare, I think she talked about the principle of severability, the judicial principle, and talked about, just because one aspect of Obamacare is, has been invalidated by the court, that doesn't mean the rest of the law has to get thrown out. That was something that stood out to me. And beyond that, I think she didn't really entertain any of the judicial hypotheticals from Democrats. She said, I'll abide by the principle, just kind of gave a very canned answer. I think Democrats were getting frustrated by that because maybe they were trying to go with a little gotcha question, but that's just kind of my take and how I interpreted it. So as far as my general thoughts, it was a very partisan hearing. I don't think this nomination process has anything to do with the judge that's being nominated. It has everything to do with the context within the election and the precedent that around the Merrick Garland stuff from 2016. So that's really all my thoughts.
So the feeling is people know who they're going to vote for, and they're using it as a opportunity to campaign a bit or kind of frame the issue for people.
Mm-hmm.
But let me ask a question to everyone here. Does anybody have any concerns about, for example, this particular judge's qualification for the court? Because that in general is what the sort of like duty of the Senate would be in this case, right? There's a nomination process, and then the Senate really thinks about this person qualify or not, and as opposed to a campaign thing. Is there any concern about qualification here?
I don't have any concerns off the top of my head. I think she's, I think a circuit judge. and so she's clearly well qualified. I think some of her positions are a little too far right for me. I don't know if they necessarily have a constitutional basis, but that I think that I'm not a I'm not a legal scholar. I can't really debate that. I think but based on qualifications alone, I think she's qualified. She seems like a decent person who doesn't have like any Brett Kavanaugh like type factors related to this. So qualifications wise, I think she's good.
I agree. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with Samuel said, but I just think that for now, many people are mixed positions with qualification. Yeah, I think that one of the issues right now. Yeah, I agree with what Samuel said.
There is a third factor, though, besides positions and qualification, what you'd normally call qualifications, right? Which is judicial philosophy. So you might think she's an originalist, or what she calls an originalist, a Scalia mold kind of judge. You might think, independent of your views on, say, abortion or Obamacare or any of the other particular cases that go before the court, that that's either the right way or the wrong way to interpret the Constitution. And that's not quite the same thing as positions, right? You might think it's important, part of being a good judge, maybe even part of being a qualified judge, but not in the normal sense of qualified that we mean they went to law school, they have the right background. You might think is having a judicial philosophy you agree with. And I think that's, or that you at least think is plausible. And I think that would be a reasonable thing to vote on. But I think it's pretty clear that the parties are never going to agree on that at this point. And we're in a position of, she's clearly as qualified as the other people on the court by almost anyone's estimation. That is, if at least 7 of the other judges are qualified, surely she is. You'd have to think half the court wasn't to think she wasn't, and I think that's the debate seems to be simply about whether she ought to have been nominated now, given the precedent of what happened in Obama's last year. And I think the Democrats who don't vote for her, which I assume will be all of the Democrats, will do so on this kind of procedural ground. And maybe they'll stand down or abstain rather than voting, or I don't know what they'll do. Does anyone have any other thoughts on I mean, I think the hearings are not that interesting for this reason that it's a kind of foregone conclusion, and I think it's a foregone conclusion that she'd be nominated in another context, and I think she'll be nominated in this context.
I think honestly, the boringness of it has been kind of refreshing, because that's how a Supreme Court nominee hearing should be, right? It shouldn't be making the 5 o'clock news generally.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, and I'm a little surprised on that as well, because I think I actually was thinking that we have hearings and not necessarily vote before the election. I really thought that, and because but I don't know what the sort of internal dealings in the Senate, what they're thinking. Maybe is a foregone conclusion that we're gonna approve her, and then Democrats, if they win the Senate, I don't know what their plans are in terms of retaliation, but I think that, because that's the fear here, right? The fear of because obviously there's nothing wrong about the process of nominating her and approving her. That's nothing wrong with that. And the same way there was nothing wrong in 2016 of the Senate voting no on Merrick Garland. It was just like, that's their prerogative. They didn't vote no, but that's essentially what they did. They voted no, right? The question is whether those, taking an action like that, it's something that creates enough resentment on the other side that might lead to retaliation. And that's what I don't know how the senators internally are talking about this, what kind of expectations they have of potentially retaliating as a result of this. So that's to me the interesting part of this, the gamesmanship associated with this that we'll discover, I guess, in January. So.
I mean, when you think of it as the two sides, right, the Republicans and the Democrats, then the natural way to think of it is in terms of gamesmanship and retaliation and a kind of realpolitik that's going on. But there's another perspective that I wish we could think about it from, and I wish they would think about it from, And I mean, I think some people in the Senate are on both sides, actually. I mean, you see Lindsey Graham talking this way sometimes, or you saw him talking this way sometimes earlier. And then you see Joe Biden, I think, sometimes talking this way. Is there's been a move, as Samila said, to this becoming more and more partisan. Now, it's been becoming more and more partisan for quite a long time. The hearings have become more contentious, but it's not been a straight line, right? Like, so Ruth Bader Ginsburg was approved by the Senate pretty quickly and by a pretty large margin, with lots of people voting after the Clarence Thomas hearings, which had been much more contentious. So it's not like every time it gets worse. But what's happened recently is we had the elimination of the filibuster for
Judicial
Supreme
nominee.
Court judicial nominees, right? Which made them be able to go through faster when you had with less margins. So it let you nominate more polarizing people, and they had more of a chance of getting through. But then they get through with fewer votes, and then you had the now the case of what happened with Garland and what's happening with Barrett. So it seems like you're getting more nakedly partisan action in the court. And so you can think of it as the left retaliating for the right, which was retaliating for something the left did earlier. But you could also think there are parties in both sides that might want to move towards might value the seeming neutrality of the court and might value the depoliticization of it. And there are questions of what you would do if you were in the Senate now, or if you were running for Senate, if you were one of the candidates now, and you did value that. How can we turn the temperature down on this? How can we make it more so that we're getting 70, 80 votes for confirmations of somebody? And I don't know what the answer to that is.
There is a movement going on, and there's a movement on, and I can't remember the name of it. It's Bridges, or there's another name of it. There's essentially is an attempt to get senators and even candidates to agree on sort of like bipartisan caucus everything. There's a particular caucus in the House that does that, the Common Sense Solution Caucus or something like that. And then in the Senate, there's a group of I think 12 senators are trying to sort of establish something that they will. The way they would basically have sway on this is the 6 people from each side, and they would comfort together and say something like, okay, if we agree on this issue, then we'll take a vote internally, and if the vote goes one way, we all vote in block type of thing. So almost creating this sort of like third party in the middle type thing. And they make those commitments in terms of joining those groups in campaign times, and they raise money on those things. It's for some reason it's very difficult to maintain that commitment through the whatever negotiations they have to go through, in the chambers, in the back rooms, and so on. But I think there are some senators that react to that, as we saw, like Jeff Flake in the past, and Susan Collins, and Mitt Romney now, and what's the one from Alaska, Murkowski. Yeah, and Tester and Manchin, and I think those are still going to exist. And quite honestly, I think that if the Democrats were to retake the Senate, chances are they're getting some places flipped, right? Some red states they're going to flip into the blue column in the Senate space. So the hope there will be that those are going to be senators that will be more moderate Democrats, right? So there'll be more centrist Democrats relative to, and I think that's the hope that I have, that perhaps with the escalation and some sort of lower the temperatures, those folks in the middle might come in and say, we have a role to play here, and take if their vote can become very influential in the whatever decisions moving forward.
That's my hope too, regarding moderating things generally. Although it's hard for me to see specifically what the solution could be in the court case, to where we can get to future nominations having larger, getting 90% voting for people again. I think it would have to involve bringing back the filibuster, and I don't see how that is going to happen. So we'll see, but it's a real worry for my part. Let's turn to briefly, if anybody has any reactions to, does anyone have anything else they want to say about the court issues?
Yeah, I'd like to mention one thing. So I think Carlos touched on this a little bit about how, the Democrats are well within their right to, vote no on Amy Coney Barrett. And I think you equated that to what Republicans did in 2016. Merrick Garland never had hearings, right? He never met with Senate Republicans. They blocked the process altogether. So
Right.
I think, it's well within their right constitutionally to do that. I understand that. But, senators' responsibilities, not all of them are outlined in the Constitution, right? They have a responsibility to preserve the general integrity of the institution that is the court. And so that's kind of what stuck out to me there was that, if they had met with Merrick Garland, held confirmation hearings, and ultimately voted no based on his qualifications, then it would have made sense. But, that's not really.
I would agree with you 100% that I would much prefer, and the vote no doesn't have to be on qualifications, again, given their duties, right, and their rights. I think that if they actually hadn't gone on record and voted no, it'd be much preferable than what was done, for sure. And I'm not in any way defending the position then. It's just that it's something that was within the rules. They had the ability to do it, and they did it. There was a price to be paid. And if you think about even the strategic aspect of what they did then, what was the chance that Trump won that election? Go back in time and think about the probability that the people were giving Trump to win that election in 2016, right? Small. So nobody was counting on it. Mitch McConnell was not counting on it. There was a crazy gamble that he did. And I guarantee you this, that November 4th last time, had Trump lost to Hillary as everybody expected, they would have voted him in. It was just like one of those things that they were like, they play as a campaign rally thing, and then it worked, and it's like, oh my God, that was a miracle. So I think there was a little bit of that I think it was a big surprise, I think, but I agree that at the end of the day, there was something that created a stain in the traditions, in the sort of relationships, and I think it just exacerbated the sort of the sort of extremist process that we were going through that has various reasons that have been going on for a long time. But I think that was like another step in a bad direction for sure.
So let's turn to something or two topics at least from the town halls that came up. One's directly related to what we've been talking about, actually two that are directly related, and then I want to see if anyone else has any other topics that came out of the two town halls. One is the court packing topic. So Biden has been famously saying he won't give an answer now on it. There was a whole back and forth contentiously between Pence and Harris in their debate about it, and she also wouldn't give an answer. Biden said a little more now about it in yesterday's town hall. He's committed to saying before the election and after these hearings are over what his position will be on court packing. He's been saying all along, in effect, I'm not a fan of it, but if things are egregious enough, I don't want to take it out, whatever. I don't want to say I won't do it now. And presumably the threat is if these hearings are handled in what he regards as too awful or breaking with precedent away, then that'll be on the table as a way to correct for it. What do you guys make of what he said, of this idea of, not giving us an answer, but saying he'll give us an answer soon, and of court packing as a next move in this escalation? Both how likely you think it is and whether it would be good, justified. Is this a reason, if Biden were to come out and say he'd do it, would that be a reason to vote for him or against him? And conversely, if he'd said he wouldn't.
I personally don't think Biden will support court packing before the actual election. I guess what he said about the hearing is that he was afraid there will be another Kavanaugh's hearing again, the theatrical things. But now I think, as far as I'm concerned, the hearing is normal actually. Mm-hmm. It's like a normal, non-theatrical, boring Supreme Court hearing. So I think right now, but if Biden claimed that he supports the court packing, I think it will trigger some voters away from the Democrats. So I think the best way for him to do right now is probably just to continue this vague stance until the election's over.
Although again, he did say that he's going to say more before the election. So, but maybe he'll be vague. Chris?
Yeah, I think I mean, it's a hard spot, and I don't envy Biden for being in it, right? Because it becomes like a tit for tat, right? Because if they do court packing this time, well, then the next time there's kind of a Republican majority in the Senate and in the executive branch, well, then they can do it. And, 20 years from now, we're going to have, 45 Supreme Court justices, right? The flip side is I think the Democrats, rightfully so, feel like the Supreme Court right now probably should have either Gorsuch or Kavanaugh on there, and then potentially kind of this one other spot from RBG right now. But I think they rightfully so, feel like, hey, we got kind of shafted one seat that should have been our nominee. But it's also a dangerous thing, just like with the filibuster, because the Democrats were the ones that got rid of the filibuster, and now it's kind of come around to bite them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I do think that it's a nuclear option to go on a backing side, and I think this one is unpopular. It's popular with a very small minority, I think, of the Democratic Party. So very vocal, but I think it's small. It's not popular. It is obviously open for retaliation later on. It just like it creates, I think, a potential chaos that I don't know where it stops. If we're talking about the things that are already difficult to manage, I don't know where it stops. I think that they're going to use that as a way to pressure certain things, to pressure certain concessions essentially from the other side in other ways. That's basically something that I expect to see played out under the So if you have this veiled threat, right, you can always even see that as being a potential way to moderate the court. That's exactly what FDR did. FDR got out a bunch of stuff that was unconstitutionally done because he threatened the court. He said, "Hey, you go do this or else," right? And it worked. So he didn't have to pack the court as he promised to do. And he got some stuff that was like, when I say unconstitutional, was that there was a lot of judicial views at the time that were against the ideas that he was putting forward, and those views changed during that time. So I think that threat's going to be there, and I think that's going to some extent moderate the 6-3 majority that you have now in the Supreme Court. And again, I think it's important for us to remember that something like 85 or 90% of the cases that go in front of the Supreme Court get decided by large majorities. It's not like split votes like we see. There's a few contentious things that get a lot of attention. But I think because of that, I think if people realize, I would hope that the adults in the room realize that for the most part, the body works really well. And yes, if there's disagreements on certain things, there can be consequential at times. It might not be justified to go break with the tradition that's been going on for so long.
So there are two questions that we can kind of run together, or three really. How likely are the Democrats to go for court packing if they have the option? Two, would it be prudent for them to do as a matter of realpolitik? And three, do we want them to do it? Would it be good for the country? Some people in the country are keen to have court packing. It seems like, is anyone here among them? It seems like most of us who have spoken are not.
So yeah, I'd like to kind of chime in on this. Mm-hmm. So as far as, you said the three questions are, will they do it? Would it be good for the country? And do we want them to do it?
The second one was, would it be politically shrewd of them to do it?
Okay.
And the third was, do we want them to do
it? So I would say the answer for me to all three questions is no. I think their position of ambiguity is more or less just a shrewd political calculation. I think they understand that, keeping that door open towards court packing is a point of political leverage. So, they'll say that, if you nominate Barrett now, we'll pack the court later. So don't nominate her, or, that it's not working, but it's a point of political leverage. And that leverage applies to, I guess, federal and circuit court nominations as well, I guess. And as far as, you said the second question was what, Craig?
Is it a shrewd calculation for them? I think you answered that.
Yeah,
also, it's not working. And the third is, would you like the court pack? Would you like the court to be expanded?
I would not like the court to be expanded, actually. I think I have my fair share of quips with the court. I think the court leans further right than the country is, and I don't think it's representative of it. That being said, I think it's, like Carlos said, it's a nuclear option. I think once you start packing the court, Republicans will do that the next time. And, by the time I'm 40 years old, we'll have 35, justices on the court. So
I think we've all on a previous episode talked about this 50 justices, 100 justices. The problem with that, right, isn't just there's too many, we'll have to order extra robes or something. The problem is that the court's positions are going to shift every time new people are added, so it'll become unpredictable. There's nothing, I don't think anyone thinks that's special about the number 9. What's important is having some kind of stability and continuity rather than a super mercurial court like you would get in that situation.
Yeah, and I think, sorry, one more thing on that. I think that people also view, and it's really only in the last 20 years, this justice is like on our team. And they forget that, heck, John Roberts has sort of become the swing vote, right? And back in, the W administration, he was like the new brand of conservative. And so he's kind of filled the role that Anthony Kennedy played for a time. And so I think the justices, regardless of whether or not, like, I personally kind of agree with how they interpret the Constitution, they are by and large well qualified. They're smart, thoughtful people, and there is always the opportunity for them to surprise us, or to kind of shift their views over time. Even Gorsuch has done that already. He's kind of gone in a non-conservative direction politically on some of the rulings that they've had this term.
And so did Kavanaugh. So it's not as clear. That's the thing. I think we politicize something that's not clearly political in the way that people like to draw the right-left lines, right?
Well, yeah, the politics don't quite line up to right-left.
No.
So I think it was Gorsuch on the LGBT discrimination ruling, voted with the 6-3 majority. It was Gorsuch and Roberts that sided with liberal justices. And I think it was, I believe both Trump's nominees voted against him on the tax returns. And then I think the Louisiana abortion, restrictions ruling, it was 5-4 Roberts. So Kavanaugh only switched over once.
So, Neil, let me ask you. Sorry, Greg. I think we're spending a lot of time in this topic, but I think it's important to understand even where people are coming from. Can you name a major decision that the court has made? You mentioned that you think the court leans more right than the country is. Can you name a decision that is particularly upsetting, given that statement that you make, in the past 10 years?
Well, you're putting me on the spot here. I would say the first is Citizens United. I think that's a general, sentiment around the country, is that money should not be in politics to the scale that it is. But the Citizens United ruling allowed for that. And I think it's a very, right-leaning interpretation of the Constitution that allowed for that ruling. So yeah, that's the one that really sticks out to me. And I think
that was pre the sort of shift to the right? The somehow the decision was made. I think there was still
It was I think
during Bush, right? So that was the 5-4 probably decision.
Right, but it was before Kagan and Sotomayor were on the court, so the court hadn't shifted left and then back right. So it was more or less where we are today.
Right.
So is anyone for Citizens United? Does anyone think that was rightly decided on the call? I do, but I don't know if anyone else does. Of the people who think it's rightly decided, this is metrics of how well these are correlated. How many think Roe should be overturned or severely limited?
I don't have a particular view on Roe. I don't understand the details of the sort of sequence of decisions that led to the way that was interpreted, but I do think it's a bit of an overreach. But I think the way it has been now codified in multiple subsequent decisions becomes something very hard to change. And I think that the court has been clear on the limits that states can have on limiting abortion and so on. And I think it would be very, very difficult to see that going away.
What about, I always have trouble pronouncing this guy's name, Objergefeld, the gay rights, gay marriage decision? That's the other one that people are, there's worry about.
I mean, so I guess the question is, what are you asking the question on if I think that if I like the decision or I don't like the decision. So I like the
Would you-
decision from the outcome
Uh-huh.
perspective. I think that's great that we're giving people that deserve, equal rights in a lot of ways. Do I think that is the right place for the decision to be made in the courts? And the answer is no. I think that is, that was the reality on the ground in some ways. I mean, for the most part, if you think about the sort of involvement of gay rights in the country, it's just like amazing, right? We have gone, we had so much progress has been made. And that sort of gets sort of codified in federal law now, which is, in some ways is good. It moves forward a little bit more, right? But when I say that I don't like those decisions being made in court, is because I think that just creates more resentment and more like sort of politicization of the process in a way that, let people vote on there's a legislative process to get there. And I think we're getting there. We're moving in that direction anyway. I think with abortion, I mean, quite honestly, if Roe was to be overturned, I don't think you would have enough states, really outlawing abortion. You would have more restrictions and so on. And maybe there would be a few states in the South that would go a little crazy. But I think, a vast majority of the population in the country would still have access to abortion. So my point being is that I might not like a reversal of abortion rights. But I think from a procedural point of view, I think a lot of this sort of politicization of the court comes from decisions that will be better taking place on the legislative process.
I have a different view on that. I think a lot of these, decisions ought to be judicial. I think both the gay rights, they could have been done legislatively, and that would have been good too. But I think on the gay rights, the marriage rights, and the abortion, I think it was appropriate for it to be done judicially. But and I wouldn't like to see it overturned. I do agree that if Roe was overturned, I think probably, we'd have to debate what's a lot of states and what's a few states. I think it's already harder to get an abortion in Texas than it is in New York and a lot of other places. So, and other states are harder than Texas. So, I think it would really make a difference. But it could also be, if the Democrats had the House and the Senate, they could pass a law, right, that established all the rights in Roe across the nation and basically invalidated the state law. Of course, then the next time the Republicans got it, they could undo that law.
But that wouldn't
So
be
I think-
constitutional. That's the thing too. That would be that could be
Well, it's not
invalidated by
clear
the
if
court.
the law would be
The federal government.
unconstitutional. It would be the grounds on which you'd find it unconstitutional. I think you'd have to find a lot of other laws unconstitutional. So there are. Put it this way: if Obamacare doesn't violate if the Commerce Clause gives the federal government the power to instate Obamacare and a million other things that don't obviously involve interstate commerce, surely it gives them power over abortions. After all, the baby, if it comes to be, might buy something from another state someday. So I think that's too wide a reading of the Commerce Clause. But this brings me to one last court question, actually, or court observation. It's a lot easier to be a radical when you're in the minority. So, if you think about what the Republicans were saying when they were not in power and couldn't do anything, the House passed, I don't know how many times, undoing Obamacare. It couldn't pass it when they had the House and the Senate, right? So when what you're doing is a symbolic gesture, let's get rid of Obamacare, let's overturn Roe, let me write this in a dissenting opinion. It's very easy to be bombastic and say you want a huge change when you know that you're doing it's not going to make that change. When you're actually going to be responsible for a lot of people's lives changing really quickly, people tend to moderate how they do it, either because they're afraid or because they really hold the principle, but they think if I'm going to act on this principle, there's a more gradual way that it has to be implemented than, changing the law overnight. And I think that's one reason why you see people when they're in small minorities tend to write these very bold dissenting opinions, but as they get more power, they tend to be a little more moderate, middle of the road in how they interpret it. So I think you'd expect the court to move right, but not, it's not to start issuing things that sound like Thomas's dissents.
I hope so.
Yeah, and candidly, I don't think that the GOP would actually not be very thrilled if Roe were overturned. Like they say that they will, but that is the kind of lone carrot that they dangle in front of a huge number of single issue voters. And so if they get rid of that as an issue, then they don't really have that carrot anymore. And so while they go out and parade that around as something that they want to do, I don't think that they actually want to.
I mean,
And
part of
a
the
lot of other voters, I think, as a result of that too, right? Potentially, you have now potential single issue voters on the other side that So I agree with you, and it's a very convenient situation right now.
I mean,
Yeah.
part of the issue is who is the GOP? Are they the base that goes out to vote on that issue, or are they Mitch McConnell, or are they, I don't know who. When you say what a party wants, it's a little hard to know whose mind we're reading, so to speak.
Fair.
But no, that's right. But I mean, I think like I'm inclined to agree on some issues with the really radical Thomas dissents. I'm a philosophical radical, and I'm a radical on politics, though I talk about wanting things to be more moderate right now in certain respects. But if you have a radically different vision from where we are now about where you want to get, you have to think about, how to get there and what are the steps. And the steps can't be, or at least I don't think they should be, and most people who are actually in a position to make decisions don't want them to be turning the country upside down overnight. All right, did any other issues come up in the town halls that strike anyone as they're excited to talk about them?
Yeah, I found it curious that when pushed, Trump didn't have really a good defense for some of his retweeting activity, specifically with like some of the QAnon things, and it, it it's really kind of stupefying because I don't understand that as he's being pushed back against it about, hey, well, that's obviously false, and it's just a retweet. Like, I don't know, I retweet things all the time, and it's fake news, and so I have to get information out there. And so I thought that was one of the things that I would like to say I was surprised at how he handled it, but I also have watched him be president for 3.5 years and am like not surprised.
Exactly.
Even before he was president, I believe, maybe it was just after, he retweeted some statistic about homicide rates, black people and white people. I forget what it was. That was apparently very wrong and came from some very dubious source. And Bill O'Reilly was, you can't, what do you, I just retweeted it. I found it somewhere and I retweeted it. And O'Reilly, who's hardly a hostile room for Trump, I would have thought, is saying, you're running for the president, man. You can't just retweet every random thing. So this is a pattern going back some time that he's taken some flack, even from sympathetic people for it. So I can't say I found it surprising, but it's I find it horrifying every time this happens. And to me, it's the same issue as we spoke about last time with them asking him why he wasn't wearing a mask in a certain situation. He was saying, well, it's recommended, it's not required. As though there's something just so offensive to a sense of rationality about answering a question like that way. It's like, I don't have to think. I don't need reasons. Reasons don't matter for how you act or live. That I really worry about the cultural effects of having someone in a leadership role who expresses what I see as flagrant contempt for rationality. If he had some, better line of BS, at least seemed ashamed of it, there would be a kind of respect for standards of discourse, and I find it really troubling that they're so lacking. But I think we knew this already. It's kind of priced into him. And some people like it and other people don't, but think, when you consider all the other options, it's...
I agree with you that I think that the sort of normalization of standard, right? It's not like me and you retweeting something, right? So if I retweet something because I thought it was funny and it turned out to be inappropriate, it's like, okay, bad choice, but like, I'm not followed by millions of people, and hold the presidency, right? So obviously we need a different standard between me and you retweeting versus the president. And he has definitely normalized behavior of politicians. And by the way, politician behaviors have been bad in a lot of ways, but there was at least some more of a standard of decorum that politicians lying is not something new. That's the case from the beginning of history. The question is, even there was a way to lie that's more, more dignified, and he just definitely, pushed the boundaries on that to points that is just not comfortable, right? And I unfortunately don't see, given the sort of media apparatus that we have, do you see this going backwards in a positive way, or do you think this is going to be sort of like a bit of the normality now?
No,
Not as extreme as him, of course, but
I can definitely see it going backwards. We've had backwards in the sense that we can move in a more positive direction. I think we've had times where we've had presidents that kind of eroded people's trust in the office of the presidency. I think you saw that with Andrew Johnson. You saw that with Nixon. You even saw it with Bill Clinton to a certain degree. It just, you just need the next guy to kind of preserve that integrity. And, if you have multiple, so whatever you think of George Bush, whatever you think of President Obama, they both, I think carried themselves well, and they somewhat restored faith in the office of the presidency. So I do think we can move in a positive direction.
Is Biden going to tweet?
I hope not.
or will he tweet like that?
Yeah. Well, he does. They're just rational tweets.
I think it's possible. I mean, so there are two things. Suppose Biden wins, and there's how does Biden tweet, and then there's also how do Biden's opponents tweet, either the presidential candidate running against him or Harris or whoever the Democrat is in the next election, and the Senate leaders and so forth. And do we get a bunch of Trump clones in high positions of power, or do we get Republicans who comport themselves more like politicians used to? And I don't know. I think Trump is always going to be a kind of unique phenomenon, his particular style. But I think whether we get politicians moving in that direction more or not is a function of what happens in this election. If Trump wins, I think this is going to become the norm in politics, and we're going to get, I worry, a kind of left that does the same thing in their politicians, a kind of brazen, more brazen type of leftist politicians. And if Trump loses by a little, I think we'll get, Biden being more gentlemanly in his deportment, but a lot of people on both sides saying, no, you got to be more Trump-like to really excite people. And I think if we get a Biden landslide, there's more of a possibility of everyone thinking this was an embarrassing wrong turn the country took, and you can't have a president acting this way, and us not seeing this kind of behavior in national politics. At least that's, at least I hope that's what happens. But I think it's pretty plausible in the case of a Biden landslide. I mean, you didn't get a candidate. If you think of the last serious landslides have effects on what kind of people you get from both parties in the next generation or two. I think the anti-McGovern landslide, you can't really call it pro-Nixon, but the anti-McGovern landslide made us have very much moderated Democrats for quite a while. And if there's a landslide for Biden, nobody's going to interpret it as the country loves Joe Biden so much. They're going to interpret it as it likes that he's boring and normal. And we want, politicians who seem a little bit exciting, but basically, seem establishment and normal-ish.
So assume, I'm going to assume Biden wins because that's by a lot the most likely event here. Who is the Trump standard bearers in the Republican Party right now? Who are going to come, follow up and with that sort of Trump, not only the action type Trump, but like who are going to be the ones supporting things like limits to immigration, being very anti-immigration, somewhat anti-trade, some more populist. I mean, what is it in terms of the leadership that there is in the GOP right now?
Yeah.
Well, go ahead, Simon.
Oh yeah. So I think what I said earlier, I think Trump's rhetoric, I think that's a temporary shift for I guess, the presidency and the Republican Party, I think they'll return to somewhat of a level of normalcy. But as far as politics go, the populism, the anti-trade, anti-immigration, I think there's a real appetite for that within the Republican Party, and I don't think there's going to be a real reversal to the era of like I guess country club Republicans, right? I would say that the next up to bat would be Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri, Senator Tom Cotton, Arkansas, as well, and the House. I think Jim Jordan, Matt Gaetz, those kind of the people who have the politics of Trump, but not the rhetoric of Trump. I think they're next up to bat. I don't think there's really going to be a reversal in that kind of moderate, old school Republicanism.
And you didn't name, I think Rubio is somebody that also in a much more smooth way, but I think Rubio has embraced a sort of nationalistic, populist Republican type of approach that is, and he's going to try to differentiate himself from Cotton and Harley, but in a similar way still in terms of policy.
Yeah, I think
Protectionism and so
we
on.
were talking before about are we going to get people who are, because I don't think the tweeting is a matter of personality. I think there's a cognitive style that has a real impact on the country that goes with the kind of retweeting craziest things, being very bold in how you do that, not apologizing for it, and being kind of outright in your lies and so forth, which is different than policy positions. You could imagine somebody who had pretty nationalistic anti-trade positions, but comported himself very differently, and I think that person would have a different effect on the country. But yeah, I agree with Simil that I think it's hard. There's harder to see the Republican Party being a pro-international trade party in the near future, or the Democratic Party being that, which is part of what I think is so frightening about Trump. I mean, I regard him as a catastrophe for the country and as having done tremendous damage, because I think what he's done is switched us from having, in addition to the role modeling, this kind of antipathy for reason is one side of it, and the other side of it that I think is harder to undo is I think he's created a situation in which both parties have become anti-globalist. Now, he's not, that probably was on the verge of happening, but he, I think, really precipitated it when previously the parties were both in favor of international trade agreements. And I don't know, I think we'll see a reversion to more polite politics maybe, but I find it harder to see less Buy America kind of stuff when both parties are now pushing for it. Maybe the best we can hope for, those of us who want to see less of that and who want to see more free trade, because of course that's not a given that we all agree on that, it seems most of us here do, is that issue being deprioritized. Any other big things that stood out from these what do you call it, town halls from everybody? I mean, one other issue, Chris, you mentioned the Trump being called on on that retweeting something. There was also the other thing in style with that was the being asked to disavow things, which he's always being asked to announce and disavow things. And this time he did disavow white supremacy, which he was a little more clearly, where he's a little more tentative about it in the previous one. But then there was the kind of interesting exchange about QAnon. So I don't know if anyone has comments about that.
So I never get to see the exchange about QAnon. I think it seems like it's something where, Trump's created a storm that he can't necessarily control. I think contrary to what people think. I think he's tapped into, I think I like to say that Trump is and from my perspective, I think Trump's a symptom of the problem rather than the problem itself. And I think there's this big movement of just kind of people that are aggrieved because of their economic and social situation, but also people that that he's basically just tapped into them. But then they have a propensity to believe these things, and to keep them energized, he just kind of, even though it's not politically convenient for him, to, not disavow it, he continues to stay kind of quiet and ambiguous about QAnon and things like that because he knows that his base likes it.
Did anyone else have any thoughts on the QAnon exchange? I mean,
Yeah, it's interesting because so I have the full disclosure. I have a couple of Facebook, I will call them Facebook acquaintances. I don't know that we're friends, but who are like neck deep in the QAnon movement or whatever you want to call it. And it is, I just, frankly, I don't understand it because it's this position of there is some operative within the government that is helping Donald Trump fight the deep state, and they buy in on that, but then also don't believe a CDC report that says like, hey, masks are at least mildly effective in preventing the transmission of coronavirus. And so like the intellectual discord is just something that I have a hard time grappling with. And so I think to Samil's point, QAnon is his base, not his entire base, obviously, but I don't know of anybody that supports the QAnon idea that is voting for Joe Biden. And so it would be, of course, politically not good for him to disavow them.
well, but doesn't it matter how big? I mean, if this is some, fraction of a percent of his base that believes that the Democratic Party is a cabal of deep state pedophile ring runners, it depends how many they are. If there are like, a few hundred people like this, it seems like he could disavow them with no problem. Are they so many people that think this, that it's going to change margins, or it might be? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a difficult question to answer because from just kind of what I've read and seen, it seems like a not insignificant number of the accounts are not based in the United States. And so whether that's like Russia or China or whoever else it is. And so I think it'd be really difficult to quantify the number of United States citizens who are eligible to and do vote that make up that contingency. The effects of social media has made their presence extremely large. But yeah, I think it would be really hard to quantify the number.
Part and parcel of the view of reason and evidence that I find so troubling, him promoting. Let's switch though to some, unless anyone has any further comments, to some of the particular. We actually got in some of these town halls some actual policy. I mean, in Trump's we didn't. I'll say, but I will name one policy issue that at least came up. We didn't get much of an answer to it, and then in Biden's we got some. And so let's just talk about two policy issues, what we heard in each of them, and what we like and dislike about them. First, one from Trump and one from Biden. And this goes back to the court. So he was asked what he would do about health care. And in particular, there's the Trump claims that he's going to preserve pre-existing conditions, protections for people with pre-existing conditions, even after Obamacare is eliminated, if it's eliminated. He claims a lot of credit for having gotten rid of the individual mandate, and he but he's being pushed on the fact that there's currently a case being pushed, going through the court that would, if the administration is successful in the court case, would overturn Obamacare. And the question is, well, what would replace it if it got overturned? Do you have something waiting in the wings? You haven't passed anything. What would it be? And all we're getting is we'll have something better, basically. And that will preserve protections for people with pre-existing conditions. Whereas the Democrats are saying, well, if this court challenge is successful, all these people with pre-existing conditions will suddenly be thrown out and they'll not have any coverage. And there won't be any safety net for them. So what do people make of this? Does Trump have a plan that, or is it plausible that he'll come up with one? He did, by the way, in the 2016 election. His page had specific proposals, none of which ended up getting voted on in Congress, and some of which I liked, I should say. What do we expect will happen if Trump wins what are the impacts for healthcare of a Trump second term? And what do we expect to happen? Do we favor them or not?
I don't see a big change, honestly. I think that the Republicans have a lot of the points. In fact, we're going to have a debate in a couple of weeks, maybe 2 weeks time, on the center here with Vic Roy, that has this sort of has been making this conservative pitch for universal coverage. And he's, he was Mitt Romney's policy advisor back in the day. So he's somebody that has been writing about sort of more Republican-ish, more market-friendly versions of essentially what we have right now, right? Moving us to a more market-oriented system while maintaining a sort of approach for universal coverage. And a professor from the Dell Medical School is going to be the one taking the side of pushing us to something like a more single payer type of approach. Anyway, so that's just a pitch for something we're going to have in 2 weeks time. But I do think that those ideas that Avic's going to be talking about are ideas that are kind of like things that have been on the plate of a lot of congressional Republicans for a while now. And they couldn't, in the first year of Trump, right? So there was this symbolic movement of eliminating Obamacare or voting out Obamacare, some of the provisions of Obamacare without the transitioning aspect of it. I think the transitioning part is the part that's most difficult. I think there are ideas out there of things that could be good in terms of a more market-based approach for healthcare. But I think nobody has thought through how we would transition from the current, mostly government-run health insurance that we have, health coverage that we have, to a market-based one that Republicans and people like me would like to see. So that's the part that I think is very complicated. And because of the complication associated with the transition, I think that the inertia is so strong that I think politicians would be very afraid of voting like they were voting to overturn that, right? So. And I think it's very interesting that you mentioned the mandate. The mandate was removed and nothing happened. Prices didn't go up as a result. It was something that was completely surprised, right? So all of a sudden you don't force people, the sort of health and young, they're needed to subsidize to provide the cross subsidies. There was a decrease on those folks buying insurance, and yet it didn't really change the dynamics of the law in any way that was meaningful. Partly because the penalty for the mandate was too small to begin with, right? So that's the reason there. So I don't see big changes coming from if the Republicans are in control. I think there'll be marginal changes, marginal improvements, marginal things that might sort of like create a couple of things that improve, potential marginal improvements, I should say. I don't expect big changes there. I expect potential big changes if Democrats actually in control.
Did premiums go up when the individual mandate was repealed?
Sorry?
Did premiums go up when the individual
mandate? No, not very much. That was the part that was very surprising. The sort of delta of not different than what was going on before. So sort of the increase was actually have slowed down quite a bit. I'll try to find that. There's an interesting article written about that. I'll try to find and send it to the group because that was interesting. That's something I read recently.
Yeah, I also don't see much of a change under Republicans, but I think that's in a way a problem on both sides. I think the healthcare system is awful. I think now, and I don't think it's anything like a market healthcare system. It's a kind of disorganized, socialized medicine, and I think we'll get one or another kind of tweak to it with either party. Maybe a bigger tweak with the Democratic Party than the Republican, but either tweak I expect would be in the direction of it being more socialized than now rather than less. Certainly everything Trump says he's going to do is making it more socialized rather than less. You really need creative thinking about how to unsocialize it, and the right just has no appetite for that. So I think, it's unclear exactly what policies we'll get, but it seems to me we're in some kind of socialized medicine already. And
so what's the group's view on most likely to happen if Democrats are in control of Congress and Biden is in the presidency in terms of healthcare?
Anyone?
Go ahead, Greg.
Go ahead, Tim.
Oh yeah. I would just say I think we'll have that, I guess, added public option, right? It's an option to buy into Medicare If you're
As we know it, Medicare as we know it.
I don't know. I think it'd be a revised form of Medicare. I think it's for people living in states that blocked the Medicaid expansion. I think
Okay.
I don't know the exact number of states that blocked Medicaid expansion, but a small number, a good number of them did. The other thing I could see is I think Senators Brown, Baldwin, and Casey have introduced, or no, Brown, Baldwin, Stabenow have introduced the Medicare at 50 plan. So people under the retirement age would be able to buy into Medicare sooner. I think, the hypothetical effect of that would be that, you have high risk people that aren't buying into Obamacare exchanges. They're buying into Medicare instead. Once you remove those high risk people from the pools, premiums would hypothetically go down. Obviously, hypotheticals are a tricky game to play in healthcare.
I mean, I have a similar, my sense is a little vaguer than you have really specific views about what'll happen. But my sense is, expansion of Obamacare, meaning more public option, but not, I think, a radical change, at least in the next several years. Maybe the next step would be single payer after that. But if you think we need to move to, I think our medical system is in a stage where it's sort of on a trajectory to going from like 70% socialized to 100% socialized. I don't think anything can stop that other than specific plans to figure out how to reverse course. And so whether the next 2% goes at 2% a year or 8% a year, I don't think is as important as what can cause a pivot. And I think the pivot has to, and it may well be that it's easier some things that make it a little more socialized a little faster may turn out to be things from which it's easier to pivot. For example, I think a big issue in healthcare is it possible for doctors to operate outside the Medicare system? And if we had a situation where a lot more people got Medicare, but also it was possible for doctors to take non-Medicare patients while taking Medicare patients, not likely to happen. But that change, I think, can doctors, for example, take both kinds of patients or work at a hospital that takes Medicare patients, but this doctor doesn't. Changes that would allow for that, certain doctors to disentangle their practice for Medicare, I think are a lot more important than changes about how many people get on Medicare, from the perspective of making it possible for there to be a medical industry that's separate from the socialized part of it. At least this is what doctors who are telling me, who are trying to think about how can I make my career work.
I think the more likely event is that we move closer and closer to what you see in places like England, where we go into a nationalized thing but then, a market that's going to basically constrain the access, that's going to create lower quality as a result, but then we're going to create a escape valve that people like you and me and probably all of you in the call are going to buy into, and have you're going to have the better service, right? So that happens in Canada, that happens pretty much everywhere where you have a system like that. And that might be something that, some people claim that's a good idea because you're helping a certain segment of the population more. But as a result, again, the medical profession, there are entrepreneurs there. They're not going to be the notion that was inside of Bernie's plan of like, no, we're not going to allow for private practice at all to take place. That's something that there's no way that becomes legal in this country. So
I think that's right. And the issue is, can you get, if you believe in free markets like I do, and I know you do, Carlos, you want a very different kind of medical system than we have now. What we have now is a kind of weird hybrid with bits of market but a lot of government regulation. And all that's going to happen is some kind of shuffling around of where the bits of freedom are. And the question is there a way to get that shuffling around to go that can let them expand? Like, get into a situation where certain people can just go into the escape valve and buy out of the system altogether. And if we get into a situation where they're doing so much better, maybe we can, from there, be in a position to argue about whether we can get more people onto this kind of free system.
That I think is not a possible route, honestly, because I think that only a very small fragment of the population will have that access. And yes, it's going to be much better, but I think it's not going to be something that is ever going to be scalable enough unless I don't know, somebody comes up with a really good idea there. I think
I mean, it would put us into the position we are with education, right?
yeah.
Where you're arguing for school choice from a perspective of only a very small number of very wealthy people have it.
Right.
Trying to,
I think that's exactly what I see in the future. If we continue down the path, is something that looks like the school system, where it's okay, but could it be a lot better? And people look for a lot better outside, and just costs a lot of money, right?
that's also my guess as to where we're headed. I think. So let's talk about the another issue. Biden didn't talk much about what he'd do about healthcare but he talked about a couple of things. There was material on tax policy, on COVID policy, and on environmental policy. So let's just say a word or two about some of those. On COVID policy, we saw him talking about trying to get in place what's needed for a test, trace, and isolate regime. I think almost everyone agrees that would be really good and help us a lot if we could have it. It's unclear to me from what Biden said whether how realistic it is to get something like that up and running on the timescale he wants. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that.
It's not realistic. It's not going to happen, and it's pointless at this point with the endemic virus. So
There's just too many cases at this point. If we can play the hypotheticals all day long, I think Biden saying this, it's more of a point to say, if I were president when COVID had broken out instead of Donald Trump, this is what I would have done. Fair point in that case. But, if he were to become president, he would become president in January 2021, not January 2020. So,
well, there's still the question of could the availability of rapid tests be rapidly scaled up? What's preventing that from happening now? And if they were, what would change, right? Like if everybody could know on a dime what their status is, even with a pretty large margin of error, but still, how much would that change about what could open on what scale, how safely?
I mean, that solves the pandemic right away. If everybody at home in the morning could test and decide what it is. So just even if the governments don't know about it, so individuals are getting that information, and they make better decisions as a result of that. That would be a complete game changer. Right? The thing is over right away. Is a de facto vaccination. Even if there's error there, you reduce the amount of people that are infectious in a way that sort of like ends the whole thing. Problem is that I don't think we have that. That hasn't been the sort of creative idea to do this. People are trying to do, no, government's going to go in and try to test the schools and decide what schools to close or open. And that's not going to work, because then you start creating all the problems of incentives that people will be like, no, I'm not going to deal with that. I don't want that. And then, the business is going to fight and so on, right? As opposed to something that is just like helicopter sends tests to everybody and people can do what they want with it. I think that is a solution that could really, really help. And we have technologies kind of available for $5 a pop. It's just not approved for individual use right now. So,
and interestingly, you don't see either of the candidates pushing for that.
No, I mean, you have two economists pushing for that, John Cochran and Paul Romer, from the very beginning. Just like, do that and the problem solved. That's it. It's over. And it costs nothing relatively. If you think about the $5 pop every day, it's significantly cheaper than what we've spent so far, right? If everybody in the country is given that $5 a day, it's just like it's peanuts for the problem to be solved. So that's very frustrating.
Well, see, the hypothetical there though is that you're implying that if people get a positive test, that they will stay home. When we know
but even if they don't, not everybody. That's the thing. I agree with you that some people won't, right? But if the ones like assuming that half of them stay home, okay,
slow the spread.
It's already, it kills the transmission to a point where we're already not in a terrible place right now in a lot of states. It depends on where you are, of course, but I think that just crushes the transmission to a point where de facto under control.
Yeah, sure.
No, I agree. Yeah.
So the other two that we got some detail on from Biden was tax policy and environmental policy. And on tax policy, we got specifically moving down. So the corporate rate was, what was it, 30?
35, it went to 21. Right. He wants to move it to 28.
Right. Good, thank you. Was it 35 or 32? Anyway, whatever it was. It was in the 30s, low 20s. He wants it in the high 20s. The argument against that is that it will stall a recovery, of course. The argument for that, I mean, that's not the only argument against it, but it's the argument that we're
A
hearing.
lot of arguments against it.
But it's the argument we're most hearing against it these days. And Biden's argument for it is that, in fact, we'll get a lot of money from doing this that we can use to fund much needed programs. So just thoughts on what would the impact of this change be?
Yeah. So I actually have a master's degree in taxation, so maybe I'm overqualified to comment on it. So historically, tax rates haven't really affected, recoveries or economic expansion in quite the way that I think the kind of Chicken Littles of the world are saying. It surely has an impact, but the reality is that we have now increased the national debt and the deficit, right? I think I saw somewhere that we added another $1 trillion in like 33 days, which is a new record. And we're going to have to pay for this stuff somehow. We're going to have to pay for the $1,200 that we sent a whole bunch of people. We're going to have to pay for that extra $600 a week of unemployment. And as my mom likes to say, money doesn't grow on trees. And so we've got to do it somehow. And with corporate tax rates, I think there's this notion, and I heard about it a lot in my previous life working in the tax world, that we were the highest in the world, right, at 35% or 37% or whatever. And from an income tax rate, that is accurate. But what a lot of people ignore is that a lot of other countries have VAT taxes, which if you look at an effective tax rate kind of per dollar of income or however you broke it down, we were actually one of the lower effective tax rates in the world at the time. And so does it suck and does anybody love paying more taxes? No. But I think it's something that we need to consider and we need to very seriously talk about, because we're going to have to pay the piper at some point.
Carlos, do you want to weigh in on this?
I agree that we need to close our deficit somehow. I would much prefer to attack severely the spending side, but we don't seem to have appetite on that from any side of the aisle. So if we need to raise more revenue, sure, let's raise taxes, but please let's not raise taxes in the ways that hurt people. So raising income tax and raising corporate tax is just always and everywhere a bad idea. So we should be thinking about taxing consumption and taxing carbon, and that would be something that I wish more people were openly about this, because those are the types of things that you tax something, you get less of it. If you tax corporate income, you're going to get less of corporate income. You're going to get fewer corporations. You tax income, people are discouraged from working. So that's the kind of thing that distorts decision making. Whereas taxing consumption is something that, again, every economist that you were to ask about the optimal way to tax would be through consumption. And it's possible to do consumption tax that is progressive. So that's something that's repeated all the time. No. Consumption taxes are very regressive, like false. You can make it very progressive. It's actually very easy these days to make it very progressive. It's just something that we are in this sort of like situation where it's easy rhetorically to say the fat cats have to pay more. Yeah, the fat cats are always going to pay more. Don't worry about that. They can pay more to the consumption of their jets, their jet skis, their yachts. And that's a more effective way to do it than through something that distorts the system, that makes people move corporations around and creates S Corp this, B Corp that. I mean, being in the tax space, how complicated those things can be. You just create an enormous burden to operate that really doesn't change the amount of money really coming from that bucket in ways that sounds good from like, I'm going after the corporations, but it's just not that effective. And it's hurtful for, it's not the corporation that pays. There's three people that can pay: the shareholders, the employees, or the consumers. Those are three people that can pay for the corporate tax. And I think that we never have enough studies now that show that mostly it's not the shareholder. So
Carlos, could you explain? I mean, I've heard this as a kind of Milton Friedman idea about how you can make a consumption tax progressive, most people assume it's obvious why it seems like it's going to be regressive or flat. So there are ideas for how to make it progressive. Could you just say a word or two about that? Because I think most people haven't heard that.
So the number one,
I got to drop off. I just wanted to
sure.
say that. Yeah.
Okay.
But it was good to see you guys again. I'll let you guys wrap.
Yeah, let's just have this be the last point, and we'll resume next week, by which time we should have had another presidential debate. But Carlos, I'll give you the last word on progressive consumption tax.
So progressive, I think that the word progressive is interesting, because if you just look at how much I consume versus how much a student consumes, right? I consume a lot more than a student, okay? My family consumes a lot more. So even if the rate was the same on everything, I would be paying a larger amount of taxes than a student at UT, okay? Just by the fact that I consume a lot more and my aggregate consumption is a lot larger. So that is already progressive in that sense. But I know that's not how people like to talk about progressive. They want us to pay like an increased rate, right? As you go. And so there's different ways that you can address that. You can address that by having different rates on different types of things. We already do that in the consumption tax that we have. All states have consumption tax. All states, I think pretty much all states, right? Sales tax is everywhere. Maybe there's one or two states that doesn't have sales tax. In pretty much all the states that have sales tax, they already have a progressive choice on it, which means that when you go to the grocery store, a lot of items in the grocery store are tax exempt, right? Food and so on. So that's one way that they make it progressive. The other way is really like you could make the first $10,000 of consumption of everybody tax-free. You get a rebate on that. So you can think about like your consumptions over the year, right? And that basically you don't pay any tax until the first $10,000, and then after that, for example, you pay. We have the accounting ability now through the way we run our bank accounts, the way you have our credit cards and so on, to basically you have this. So in countries that you have VAT, there's this notion that companies try to bypass the VAT by not issuing a receipt, right? So there's like in Brazil, for example, there's this campaign like ask for your receipt to make sure that companies are paying the VAT, right? If you give the incentive for people to get the receipt because then I can get a rebate, now all of a sudden every consumer is like, get my receipt because I need to show my receipts to the government to get my money back, right? So basically that's the way you would enforce this, and it's actually would be incredibly simple to do it. It's unfortunate that I think you have this problem of it doesn't sound very lefty in the sense of let's go after the fat cats, which the left likes. And it's not like something that the right embraces, because the right says, I don't know, we cannot start. It's a slippery slope. If I start a consumption tax at the national level, it's going to become like Europe, where we have income tax and you have the. So my ideal world will go do away completely with the income tax and the corporate tax consumption completely, and that would be a much better world. But that's the transition to that is not something that I expect to really see.
You did a big bill that included both elements.
That's a big bill, yeah.
Put all my former colleagues out of work. That's what you do.
Yeah, exactly.
Get them into the business.
My wife is a lawyer, so she'd lose her job probably too. So yeah.
On their first 10 grand spent or something. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Let's draw a line here, and we'll be back next week to talk about issues arising out of the next debate and whatever else we learn about during the week.
Greg, just one thing. You have everybody's email here, right? So I'm going to send a message on to everybody on that. There's a little article on the consumption tax and the one on, what was the other one that I mentioned that I was going to send?
Carbon tax.
Was it corporate tax? That's right. There we go.
All right. There's an email.